morning, Green Spring. Today we have another Who's Who, and I hope you're enjoying the Who's Who's because this is something that Marcia Dake started many years ago, and I've sort of taken up her mantra and trying to continue that program. And along that line, my objective is to talk with the candidates for the Who's Who about their lives, about what their interests are, their travels, their family, and stuff like that. Things that they would like to tell you and perhaps record for their families. So if you have a candidate that you would like to hear something about, call me or call Channel 6 and give us their name, and maybe we can have them as a candidate for Who's Who. Today we have Charlie Vail, Dr. Charlie Vail, who lives in Madison Green. And before we launch into your life, would you tell us a little bit about your family today?
I have two daughters, both with doctorates from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm very proud of these girls because of what they've done. The older one, Julie, did her dissertation on Russian psychiatry, of all things, and is today an authority on the healthcare systems of the Soviet Union of Russia. My younger daughter was a scholar of Indian religions and did some seminal work on the relationship of certain agents of these Indian religions. My granddaughter, Hannah, was a summa cum laude graduate of Bryn Mawr College. Oh. She went on to Berkeley, California at Berkeley, and got a PhD there, and today she's an outstanding instructor, professor at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. One other of my family is a woman who was part of the boat people from Vietnam, Nicola Tu Lee. She's become a foster member of our family and loved by us all. She lives in Leesburg with her family. I have 4 grandchildren, 2 under 2 and 2 under Hannah. That's about the story of my life. It's mostly found in those children than in myself.
Great. Well, both daughters have PhDs. You have a PhD. Did you have some special emphasis on getting a PhD when they went to school, or did they just naturally follow?
They just naturally followed. I had no influence whatsoever on them. Of course, they had always lived around and among college people, yeah, and that may have an influence on them. But they are fine scholars in their own rights, and I think that caused them to pursue their advanced degrees.
Do you have any stories about grade school or high school?
Not really. They were nondescript, except it has a little fella I didn't like school. I said that very plainly.
Oh, is that right? Okay. I noticed that you graduated from high school before World War II, and you got your bachelor piecemeal, but you were in the Navy during that period of time, too. How did that work?
It's hard to say. I really had only about 2.5 years of formal college education, but it was scattered around partly because of the Navy and partly because of free time. And I eventually did get a baccalaureate from Birmingham Southern College. And after the war, went back there and taught for a brief time.
Now, after the war, you pursued a PhD. Now, this is not, you weren't around, or I presume you weren't around a lot of colleges and so forth. What motivated you to get a PhD, especially in physical chemistry?
Well, it's a strange tale. I had a master's degree in chemistry and was teaching at Armstrong College, and my master's degree was from Emory University. One of the senior professors from Emory came to see me, and he said he wanted me to come back to Emory to pursue a doctorate degree and be the first candidate for a PhD in physical chemistry. Oh. They offered me exemption from certain rules and offered me some money, and it was an offer I couldn't refuse. So I went back and worked on the degree and eventually finished it.
So it was at a request of the college itself that you decided to get the
Indeed,
PhD.
It was. I did. It was not my idea, but I thought it was a pretty good idea when it was suggested to me.
Okay, I understand now, because it was kind of interesting that here you are. And to get a PhD right after World War II, having gone through the schools, there must have been some motivation, and I just wondered what that was.
It was also very difficult because my undergraduate education was sort of scattered, and I had to put things together in a hurry when I got into graduate school.
Now, before we get into your career, you are known around here for your excellent work in the woodshop. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got started in woodworking, and a little bit about our woodshop?
Well, I have to say that this is a fine woodshop. It's really well equipped and well managed. All of my life I've worked somewhat with wood. I've always enjoyed piddling with it, never got very good with it, but in retirement I started building furniture, and I read a lot and studied a lot, and acquired some skills at building furniture, and I did so for my family and friends all over the place. And at Green Spring I built some furniture, but basically I've found repairing old furniture, recaning old chairs was a fascination to me, and that's what I've been doing for quite some time.
Oh, okay. And we just, we refurbished the wood shop, didn't we, about a year ago or something like that?
An air handling system was installed to help us out, because there's always dust in a shop, and that's dangerous for the workers.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the first job you had was for Southern Research Institute, and I presume that was a result of your PhD in physical chemistry, that you were, whatever you were working for there had to do with that. Is that?
That's right, yeah.
And what kind of a job was that?
Well, it was a job in photochemistry, and was sponsored by Charles F. Kettering, the great old General Motors genius. Mm-hmm. And I got to know the man personally. His project was one that was scattered around in a bunch of different organizations around the country. I got into the project and actually solved the dilemma, which meant that he canceled the project. But it was a test for me, in a sense that I realized this was not where I wanted to spend my life, directly in chemical research, so I went back to teaching.
So you taught at the college where you'd gotten your degree for a short time, but then you were asked to come to be the dean at Hampton-Sydney College. And it just fascinates me that here you are in Southern Research Institute, but you've got your PhD in physical chemistry, but now you're asked to be a dean, which is sort of an administrative job.
Well, yes, that all administrators that I know have academic degrees of some sort or another. And the man who was president of Hampton-Sydney was an old friend of mine, and unwisely he chose me to be his academic dean. And I went there with every expectation of learning on the job, so to speak, but of doing what he needed me to do.
Well, I noted that you really received little support from the president and from the dean. You were an academic dean and the dean of students. What role did they have? Well, I asked you the role in selecting you. You said you knew the president. So the question, I guess, is how did you get along in an administration without support? Here you are, a new guy in the job.
Well, a new guy is never welcomed in a situation like that. Hampton-Sydney is one of the oldest colleges in the nation, and it had been the victim of many old traditions that were long since obsolete and with problems coming out of its ears. The dean of students saw me in his way. He had ambitions. He wanted to lead the institution, and he saw that I was in his way. But I just could not let him get in my way. I just ignored him and did what I was supposed to do in the institution as its dean. I had duties to do that were rarely given to a dean, but that was the nature of this job at Hampton-Sydney, and I did it with enthusiasm and with success.
What kind of duties?
Well, for one thing, no dean is ever required to recruit faculty. And I found that nobody had been doing anything actively towards recruiting faculty. It all became my responsibility totally the time I was there. And many of its practices, its campus procedures were obsolete and out of date. And there was just much that had to be done to rectify the place and put it in order to be a responsible academy. And that was my job, to push it in that direction.
Well, you had about, what, 8 years there?
Yes.
In those 8 years, you had lots of things to do. What can you say gave you the most satisfaction of that?
Well, I think probably the recruitment of faculty was the greatest satisfaction. If you go back in the history, you'll find that Hampton-Sydney is located in Prince Edward County in Virginia, the one county that chose in that era to close its public schools rather than integrate them. Imagine it having to recruit faculty to a liberal arts college where there are no public schools. That was a challenge that I had to overcome, and I found techniques by which to do that. But as I left the place, it had a good faculty, and I was proud of that group. And we managed to do some things that made it a very different kind of institution, serving its students as it had not done before.
Now, you were working with not a hostile, but a dean and president that really didn't fully support you. So you must have gotten some important lessons out of being able to work in this kind of an environment.
Well, you have to learn to survive. And it was a fascinating time. I loved living in that community. It really was. But it was a place full of torment all the time because of the question of public schools and the like. And so I had to rise above that, and that's exactly what we had to do.
Yeah, people may not know, but Hampton-Sydney is located about 5 miles south of Farmville, I believe.
Yes.
And Longwood College is there, which we'll get into later. But I just wanted to locate it. So, because until I'd read that it was south of Farmville, I had the impression that it was down on the closer to Suffolk, Norfolk, in that area, and I found it was south of Farmville, which surprised me. Now, you went from being dean of Hampton-Sydney to the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, whose responsibility is the accreditation of the schools in the South. Do you have any idea why you were asked to take that job?
Not at all. I had done some work for the Commission on Colleges is the portion that I worked with. I had done some work with them, and I had directed a self-study, which is one of their requirements. And I had been to one of their training sessions, so that the executive secretary knew me, I guess. It was at his initiative that I took the position.
Yeah. You know, I've found in the jobs that I had throughout life that I could, it was like you knew the president of Hampton-Sydney. Now you know this guy who probably was impressed with your work on the commission. But I found throughout life that I could pinpoint usually somebody I'd talked with or somebody who I'd worked with or whatever it was that had some influence on my next job or 2 or 3 jobs before or some action. So that's the reason I'm asking you these questions, because from my own experience, I can sometimes pinpoint why that happened. Yeah. And it usually is a personal association of some sort or action that you've taken.
Well, the Commission on College is part of the association, and I might say that the Southern Association is one of 5 regional accrediting bodies in the United States. And we had responsibility for all the southern states and for Latin America. And the job was one I had to learn when I got there. The executive secretary was not a teacher. He never helped me at all with the job. I had to learn it on my own. Yeah. But I acquired a lot of skills in the process of this and a lot of familiarity with what goes on in higher education. And I traveled extensively all over the southern states and sometimes into Latin America and consulted with colleges and universities of all descriptions throughout the region, ranging from colleges that had to deal with the death, mortuary colleges, for example, and many other types. But I got acquainted with a lot of higher education in that process.
Well, now, I would think also you had a chance to observe the student bodies and the actions of students. Can you pinpoint attitudes and political orientation, social changes, academic changes around the country? Was there some movements?
Yes, very definitely so. This was a time of student unrest and student militancy all over the nation. And the SDS and SNCC and some of these other organizations were causing great turmoil on the college campuses. And it was something we had to deal with. But there was another phenomenon in that period too. Vatican II had suddenly influenced the Roman Catholic colleges in the region. And I had occasion to work with many of those Catholic colleges which were undergoing major changes from their earlier status of operation into modern times. And it was fascinating to see what was going on in those colleges. But it was affecting student life, it was affecting the way the campuses were run, and as you know, caused some of them to go out of business.
Yeah, yeah. you answered the question. I think I was wondering about the Technological University of Mexico, but the association had responsibility then for Latin America more than just the southern region of the U.S. What accomplishment? Well, there was a. You were able to reduce the time of accreditation down to a year and a half. Was that?
Well, originally, new institutions had to graduate their third class before they could be accredited, and I saw this in the field as an absolute waste of energy. So I proposed to the commission that we change this, and they agreed to it. And so all of a sudden, we were accrediting new colleges at a pace that never had been known before. But that's one of the accomplishments I look back on with some pleasure, because I don't know why it hadn't been done. It just took somebody willing to do it. I never thought it would be approved, so suddenly I thought we'd study it for a year, but it didn't happen that way. They approved it, and we went right to work.
Good. All right, well, let's move on to Georgia State. And now you become the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. And Georgia State is a university that has about 26,000 students now. What did it have then?
It was less than 20. It was 16 to 18,000 in those days, but it was growing about 10 to 15% each year. Georgia State has a brief history. It was once a branch of the University of Georgia and another time of Georgia Tech, and had been a College of Business Administration. And when I went there, it was a brand new university in that sense. And the College of Arts and Sciences was in terrible condition. It was undisciplined and in need of a lot of leadership changes.
Well, you were able to, let's back up. You went there because you were impressed with a study that was going on, a growth study, and you were impressed with particularly Georgia State and the way it had looked about growing. And yet when you got there, the provost and the president apparently had never read this particular study.
Oh, I think they had read it, but I don't think they understood it.
But were you able to inject some of these growth aspects in the report, although they weren't
Well,
really
it was called the Academic Growth Report, and it was written by a collection of college personnel from all across North Georgia, in fact, all of Georgia. And it was a beautiful blueprint for a modern urban university. I tried to impose some of those features through my own college, but I never succeeded because the president always stopped me in what I was trying to do. And the concept of the modern urban university, which was novel to them, never came to pass because I think these guys either didn't read it or didn't understand it or didn't have the courage to deal with it. And so in the due end of time, it was just a lost cause altogether.
Was there any accomplishment at Georgia State that you were particularly proud of? Gave you most satisfaction?
Yes, indeed. I reorganized that college, took charge of its budget, and managed to put together a 10-story office and classroom building, which was essential to the institution, and disciplined the place to the point where the department heads, many of whom had to be replaced, and the faculty were now producing scholarly work. And we had in my own office a staff of young people who had devised systems for advising students that were far more advanced than anything else we knew of in the nation at that time. But bear in mind that Georgia State, located in downtown Atlanta, right off of 5 Points, had no dormitories. It had no, all of its students were commuters, and most of them had jobs. And we had the problem of advising these students. And my staff had devised systems with computer controls that enabled us to advise them very well and promptly, instantaneously, so to speak. And we were way ahead of any other university that I know about in doing this, of registration by computer, a long time before anybody else thought of doing it.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, you've gone now, you've been dean at Georgia State, you've been dean at Hampton-Sydney, and all of a sudden you're asked to become the president of Winthrop College, which is now Winthrop University, just south of the North Carolina line near Charlotte. Could you tell us a little bit about the college?
Well, Winthrop was founded in 1886 as a public college for women. And throughout those 80 years or more, it had endured irresponsible legislation by the General Assembly. It was an absolute mess and sometimes contradictory. The college, when I got there, was losing enrollment at a fast rate. If it had continued, by the end of that decade, there might have been no Winthrop. It was necessary to spend my first 9 months securing new legislation which would give a new charter to the college to be what it ought to be. Thereafter, we were able to do a lot of things to update the place inside and to make it a suitable place for both men and women.
Well, you say both men and women, but you said initially it was a women's college, so you've changed it now to a co-ed during your tenure?
That was the mantra which we used when we were seeking a new charter. Actually, the need of a new charter was made necessary by all of that old stuff that was contradictory. In fact, I think we were graduating students illegally in many ways. And so I had to spend that period of time, which was a novel effect because I was new to South Carolina. I knew not a single legislator. I knew very few alumni of the place. And here I was about to undertake a project that the old hand said, don't do it. But it was necessary as I saw it.
Well, I was interested in the way you achieved the charter because there were a lot of political factors working with the senator from or the state senator there. And what were some of the highlights?
Well, as I look
getting
back,
that charter?
There had been 20 years of effort to try to get this job done. And when I look back at it, all of the efforts were made through local people who would influence the local senator. And I considered that what we needed was the mechanism to reach to the senators all over the state. And so we had to find a way to do that. And I called on the local Chamber of Commerce to help us out and asked members of the chamber to communicate with their friends and professional colleagues all over the state to alert them to say to their local senator that Vail, the new president of Winthrop, is going to come to see you. Listen to him. And they did it. And it was amazing how well they did it. I wrote the legislation. I went through all of that process, traveling the state, dealing with all the senators I could find, and then sat in the halls of the legislature to watch this thing take place, and was so excited when it did happen. But it was a process that required the local intervention, which we couldn't have had without the help of the local chamber.
Well, we're down to less than 5 minutes, Charlie. I told you this was going to go fast.
Well, that's understandable, Charlie.
And but your daughter got sick in India, and could you just give us a minute or so about that? That was a fascinating trip.
I wish I could give you the whole skinny on it, but I learned that she was sick, not sure where she was. And several days I waited to find out she was in Madras, India. I called my travel agent and I said, get me there. And he got me to New York and aboard an Air India flight. And from there on began the most amazing trip I ever made in my life. Everything that had to happen did happen on time and in its place. And I made the trip and rescued her and brought her home. And the circumstances that the only way we could get home was for Pan Am, which was from where we had bookings, to fly us across the Pacific rather than back across the Atlantic. There's a reason for all of that. But the fascinating part was that everything that had to happen did happen. In fact, when we got back to the United States, we landed in New York as an illustration, too late for the limo that would take us to Philadelphia. And I couldn't rent a car. I couldn't get an airplane seat anywhere. I went back to the limo driver and he said, well, come back in a few minutes and I'll get a special driver to take you to Philadelphia, which happened. And that concluded a trip which just had every feature as an amazing experience. I've written it up, but it's so long I can't give you the whole story here. But
and you've done a lot of traveling. I was impressed with the South America and so forth.
I've been just about every continent except South America, except Australia. I just didn't get there.
You even got to Antarctica?
No, I didn't get there either. But I've gotten to every other continent, made numerous trips to every one of them, and enjoyed it all. I did work in West Africa for a time, and I did some work in Mexico, and the Panama Canal, I might say. But otherwise, it's all been travel for fun.
Well, after Winthrop, 2 minutes. After Winthrop, You went to your mountain cabin that you built, and now you get a call from the president of Longwood College to come back and or come there and help out as a vice president for a period of time. Could you give us just a...
Well, Longwood was a college with some internal problems. And I visited there at her invitation, the president's invitation, and I sensed those problems right away. As an old troubleshooter, it didn't take me long to find those problems. And I agreed for the 1 year and went there and helped to solve some of the problems while she searched around for a new vice president. I did not intend to stay, although I did get a petition from the faculty to ask me to stay, but it was not my intention to do so, and I went home.
And then the president, George Mason, asked you to come up and troubleshoot there, or
well,
actually
what
be a
happened
shadow
there,
of a vice of a...
What happened there was that the senior vice president was stricken with colon cancer, and they didn't know whether he'd last a year or not, and the president didn't have anyone in his place to take his job, so I went up with the intention to sit on the shelf, so to speak, to be there in case I was needed. It was an interesting year, and I was involved in a lot of activities of the university, but he never died during that year, and I left afterward, 1 year. He died some months afterwards, but it was a fascinating time at George Mason. I'd had a little history with that place. When it was a branch of the University of Virginia, Edgar Shannon was president of the university, and I'd done some consulting work at George Mason, and I wrote to Edgar Shannon, turn that place loose. It needs to be an institution of its own. And I don't know whether he listened to me or not, but he did turn him loose. It became his own, the own institution that it is today.
Well, Charlie, I'm afraid we're out of time.
Well,
I find it's interesting because, you know, we really speeded through this, through your life, that we should have taken a couple of hours to talk about most of these subjects. But I appreciate your coming on and giving us some of the aspects of your life that I found very interesting, and I hope that all of the people in Green Spring who are listening did too. I'm sure they did. And we're delighted that you chose to come to Green Spring and to run our workshop. So thank you very much for coming.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
All right.